Hello and welcome to today's MCC YouTube series on climate and the economy. My name is Nicolas Koch and I'm heading MCC's Policy Evaluation Lab. In the lab, we combine modern methods for causal impact analysis with the power of big data to improve public policy making on various pressing climate policy challenges. And today, I'm going to talk about how we seek to answer nuanced causal questions about how climate policies shape social behaviors and decisions, taking very seriously that old wisdom that correlation is not causality. We need ex post evaluations. In fact, many climate policies today are evaluated only in advance of their implementation. So as a consequence, policy interventions affecting millions of people and billions of public money have gone without any rigorous outcome evaluation after the implementation of the policy. Why is that problematic? Because the causal relationship between climate policy and welfare can be quite complicated. Let me give you an example. Think of a policy imposing efficiency standards on new cars sold for CO2 or the fuel efficiency. We have this kind of policy in Europe, in the US, in Japan, and many other places. We would expect that the policy reduces CO2 emissions quite significantly because these more fuel efficient cars require less fuel. But we know that two important factors can change that picture we would expect before the policy is implemented. First, behavioral changes play an important role. You have to consider that the standards reduce fuel consumption, so the cost of driving decline quite significantly, and that means that consumers are encouraged to drive more. And there is indeed strong empirical evidence for such so-called rebound effects that eat up part of the fuel saving. In addition, regulatory details can matter. These fuel or CO2 efficiency standards are based on ratings measured in some laboratory test. And here again, the empirical evidence suggests that firms can gain these tests and that real-world efficiency standards of cars can be considerably lower, so that the actual policy outcome is that there are significantly lower CO2 reductions than expected when the policy was implemented. Regulatory details and behavioral responses almost always drive a significant wedge between expected policy impacts and actual policy outcomes. And this is why I argue that ex post assessments of policies should be a cornerstone of effective policy. Every policy measure should be subject to a regular, high-quality empirical review. Let me first of all highlight that evidence-based policymaking is basically about learning from data. And in this respect, the opportunities for credible ex post evaluations are better than ever. Never before has there been such extensive and high quality data for empirical research, and never before have there been such powerful empirical methods for causal impact evaluation. They are based on quite some recent advances from statistics, but also the behavioral sciences and, of course, data science. And I would argue that when applied carefully, these methods allow reliable and robust policy conclusions. The key question you have to answer is, what would have happened without the policy? This is the so-called counterfactual. We use comparison groups to construct that counterfactual. The gold standard to obtain such a comparison group is to assign individuals, households, or firms randomly to some policy treatment. This is the classical experiment. We, in our research of real-world policies, usually resort to a quasi-experiment. In a quasi-experiment, the treatment assignment is as good as random. Why? Because some regulatory detail or politics or any other fortunate coincidence induces some randomness in the assignment to some policy treatment. If we couple these experimental settings with rich administrative macrodata or some other big data, we can trace the effect of policies on the different affected groups, be it firms or households, over time and learn something about the causal mechanism at place. All that was not possible in the age of small aggregated data based on sectors or country level information. One of the most contentious policy issues in the last decade was arguably the question whether the introduction of carbon pricing in Europe under the EU's emission trading scheme, the EU ETS, led European firms to relocate their production and thereby CO2 emissions to outside the EU, especially to countries where there is no carbon pricing scheme in place. So this is the big question about the role of carbon leakage. What we did is we looked into that black box of firm behavior regulated under the EU ETS using administrative microdata from Deutsche Bundesbank. The data is on foreign direct investments and for the near universe of multinational German firms. So what we observe with this data is whether these firms that face a carbon price under the EU ETS invest more outside Europe to build up new production capacity or to extend existing capacity given the environmental pressure in the home market. The quasi-experiment in that case was the incomplete participation requirements in the EU's emissions trading scheme. The EU has in fact designed the policy to include only large plants. So firms operating smaller plants are not regulated. So that means that there could be, say, a steel firm operating with a big steel production facility is in the EU ETS, and there's another firm owning two smaller facilities is not in the EU ETS because these plants for producing steel are rather small, but in aggregate produce the same amount of steel. So we are in a situation where we have EU ETS firms and non-EU ETS firms that can be comparable with respect to the production, but also their foreign direct investment behaviors, but they differ merely in the size of the plants they operate. So this is our quasi-experiment. And we pair that with powerful statistical methods called matching that ensure that we compare in that treatment group and control group only firms of similar size, of similar profitability, of similar investment patterns in the past, but also similar internationalization characteristics in general. And what we find is this: the investments outside the EU for EU ETS firms, the blue line, and non-EU ETS firms, the red line, before the carbon pricing introduction in 2005 and after the policy introduction. And what we observe is very similar investment patterns outside the EU for these two groups of firms. Actually, that slight difference that we can spot in the figure is statistically very clearly insignificant. So the conclusion, the policy inclusion, is that there is no compelling evidence for investment leakage, given this very representative German sample of very international firms. And this casts doubt on relocation threats in the EU ETS to date. Big data allows radical improvements in the way we can learn about solutions to real-world policy problems. And the rise of satellite data is a prime example for data helping to make better policy, but also data enabling robust policy evaluation. Here I'm illustrating how satellite-based data helps environmental authorities in countries with tropical forests, such as Brazil, to detect deforestation in real time and to locate deforestation hotspots, and to finally also allocate costly inspections of their environmental police to these often very remote areas where deforestation is happening. The policy challenge, of course, for environmental authorities is to visit all these sites with deforestation alerts from that satellite data. And in Brazil, they have therefore introduced a so-called blacklist with high deforesting municipalities in the Amazon. Alerts in these blacklisted municipalities highlighted in red on that map were prioritized for enforcement to enhance that inspection process. And we have evaluated this Brazilian flagship anti-deforestation strategy using the satellite-based data. The quasi-experiment in this case was that the selection criteria for the blacklist were inconsistently applied. This means that there are municipalities that should be on the blacklist based on the criteria, but they are not, which just indicates that politics matter a lot. And this inconsistency in the selection allowed us to build what we call a synthetic counterfactual using the other bluish non-blacklisted municipalities on the map. And what we find in that study is basically a win-win result for agriculture and forest. The policy simultaneously reduced deforestation and it boosted agricultural productivity, so it had economic benefits as well. Indeed, anonymization of confidential individual level data is very important, and we as researchers need timely access to such anonymized data under strict conditions and also clearly defined academic research purposes. So in this respect, partnerships with public data providers are key to bring often hitherto unavailable information into research. For instance, our lab at MCC has established such a data sharing agreement with a major health insurer in Germany. We got access to the complete medical records of millions of insured individuals based on their health insurance card records in an anonymized format. And we use this newly available data to provide some, I would argue, sorely needed evidence on a still ongoing and heated policy debate. And that's the question whether adverse health impacts causally linked to car pollution, especially pollution from diesel cars, old diesel cars, justify driving bans in cities. The quasi-experiment in that case was that we compared newborns that were protected by a diesel ban in German cities in their first year of life with unprotected children, children that would only be protected by a driving ban after year one. And the important finding from that study is that these small particulates in the air from diesel exhaust are a big deal for our public health costs. We find an important expenditure savings for respiratory diseases from a single life year with cleaner air. So this is again an example highlighting how better data can bring sorely needed evidence into often contentious, heated policy issues that are so ubiquitous in the climate policy debate.